Hello, fellow birders. My name is Denis Kania. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at the perils of migration. On the DuPage Birding Club Education channel, we'll be discussing all things bird related. As I mentioned, today we'll be talking about the perils of migration. The migration of our land birds has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, and they kind of follow the same script, and they've been doing that for all that time. And obviously there's some benefit to doing that. And so they don't want to change that script and go somewhere else for their winter vacation. There's a lot of topics that we can cover here in bird migration. And so here's what I hope to cover today. We'll talk about the benefits and hazards of migration, migration strategies, benefits of nocturnal migration, major flyways, broad front migration, natural obstacles, hormonal changes, and fat storage, which is very important. Timing of migration, and then that energy equation. So at this point in time, we see that benefits of migration are outweighing the hazards. And if that wasn't the case, then we would have lost all of our birds by now. But obviously, human influences are having a great impact on this scale. And so as we create more and more hazards for our birds as they migrate, we're going to at some point in time tip this balance, and the hazards will be outweighing benefits, and we will be ending up losing all of our birds. So this is something to really focus on. So here's some of the benefits of migration. One of the major ones being that by migrating, many of our birds that come up here to breed are leaving areas that are already well populated with other species in their wintering grounds. So by coming up here, they find more places that they can have breeding territories. Up here in the northern latitudes, we also have longer daylight hours. And so that means more feeding time. And with more feeding time, that means their young grow more quickly, and it actually gives them an opportunity to maybe have a second brood. Concentrated food sources is another major factor. And with all of my trips to Central and South America, which I've done many, many, many times, quite often I find that I have more biting insects in my own backyard than what I encounter when I'm down there. So there's a reason for that, and that is the life cycle of all of our insects up here is concentrated into a smaller window because of the seasons. So birds can count on the fact that they're going to find large concentrations of insects for them to feed on and to feed their offspring. And it's a little bit different equation than what you find down in the tropics. Some of the hazards that are equated with migration would be changing weather conditions on a daily basis. There's no guarantee of food or shelter along the way, so they might end up in very inhospitable places. And they have a lack of experience for first-time migrants and a lack of experience with new predators when they do reach those wintering grounds. So there are different strategies, let's say, that different bird families use. And I think we've probably have seen some of these in real life. When you see sandhill cranes migrating or large raptors, they're actually relying on thermals in order to carry them and gain altitude. So you'll see these birds swirling in the air, and what they're basically doing is riding the thermal up to a higher elevation. And once they get to that elevation, then they can spill out in the direction that they want to migrate, and they're then looking for that next thermal that will lift them up again. And they just continually do that. And what that allows them to do is to migrate without using up any energy, because they just have their wings open, they're not flapping. They're certainly capable when they lose those thermals to, they can flap and they can make a movement that way. But for the most part, these birds are trying to do as much as they can with as little energy as possible. And then we have many waterfowl that we've seen migrate. I'm sure everybody has seen, birds flying overhead, and you'll see them flying in a V formation. And basically, they're drafting in order to save energy. One of the things that happens that we don't get to see, and that's the majority of our passerines are migrating during night in the cover of darkness. And there are a lot of advantages to doing that. So here are some of the benefits. For one thing, the atmosphere becomes less turbulent after the sun goes down, because you are losing all those thermals. when the Earth's surface is not being heated. So the less turbulent air is certainly a benefit. Cooler temperatures after the sun goes down. And think about this for a minute. You know, if you go to the gym and you're going to exercise, do you want that room to be warm or do you want that room to be cool? And so certainly we're more effective and we can exercise for a longer period of time if we have a cool space in order to perform our exercise. Now, birds are less likely to encounter predators in the dark. And by migrating at night, that means that they have the daylight hours then to look for food during the daytime. And so then they can refuel for that next part of their journey. And also by migrating at night, it allows them to use celestial landmarks that they use in navigation. So here's a map, kind of a representation of what the North American flyways look like. And you can see there are 4 represented here. We have the Atlantic Flyway on the right, and then we have Mississippi Flyway, which is near us, and then we have Central Flyway and Pacific Flyway. And I know as a child growing up, I used to hear this term, the Mississippi Flyway, and I used to envision that it was like an expressway along the Mississippi River Valley, and all the birds would kind of funnel into that area and they would move along that course. And this map that I'm showing you here and the representation on here almost leads into that as well. It almost looks like a series of on and off ramps, and we have some major routes that the birds are taking. And that's not quite the case. I mean, there's certainly, you can say that, you know, birds are not going to deviate away from these certain areas. Those that are on the Atlantic Flyway are sticking pretty much to migrating through that Atlantic Flyway. Same thing on the other coast, on the Pacific coast, as examples. But what's really happening is that there's a broad front migration taking place. And just as an example, if we would consider research that's been done at the Linwood Springs Research Station in Stevens Point, Wisconsin, where my son was going to school, and that's my son in the middle there. They had a program where they were banding saw-whet owls. And so they had a sounding device that was set up. And so that would call in saw-whet owls to an area where they had a bunch of mist nets. And they were capturing saw-whet owls as they were migrating and then lured to this area because of the sounding device. So the record that I recall is that they actually caught 70 northern saw-whet owls in one night. And if you think about that and how many saw-whet owls are migrating on the many nights of migration, it's pretty hard to imagine why we can't seem to find saw-whet owls down here. I don't know where they hide. But think about that for a minute. If this man's backyard where the research station is about as wide, if this is the whole state of Wisconsin across my whole screen here, and then if you think about this person's backyard being represented by just this letter I here across the entire state, just think of how many saw-whet owls are migrating across the entire state and how many saw-whet owls are migrating across all of the Midwest. The numbers are, in my mind, are staggering. If you can get 70 of them in one location that's as narrow as that across the entire state. So, what I'm trying to represent here is that the owls or any other bird are actually migrating in a wide swath. And we're just, you know, wherever we are, we're seeing just one small sliver of the entire migration that's taking place. So some examples of migration that we can actually witness in the daytime would be things like I mentioned earlier, waterfowl migrating over. And we certainly have all seen the skeins of geese or ducks forming these V formations and flying, you know, from north to south or the reverse in the springtime. And the other thing that we're probably have witnessed at some point or other is these huge clouds of blackbirds that are undulating across the horizon in front of us. And so those are birds that are gathering and actually on the move in migration. So those are two things that are easily recognized, I think, by most people, even non-birders. Another bird that migrates and is quite conspicuous, and I can remember as a child seeing these birds all over the sky in the evening, and this is common nighthawk. And as they do migrate, they come in large flocks, and as I said, any non-bird would even notice them because they're just so erratic in their flight as they're chasing insects that you can't help but notice them. So they're actually making a very long migration. Here's their range in North America, and they're moving down through a couple different avenues. Some are migrating along Mexico, some are actually crossing the Gulf, and some are island hopping their way down here to South America. But here's where they're actually wintering. So it's a very long migration. And they typically, when we see them, we're seeing them when they're coming through in advance of a cold front. And they do feed on the wing, as I mentioned. So that's when we're seeing them. And again, it's very erratic flight that you're seeing. And they'll actually hunt as long as they can, as long as insects are available, and they're catching them on the wing as they are migrating. So here's a question that I quite often get, and that has to do with American robins and migration. And people want to know, if robins are migrating, why do I see so many robins in the wintertime? And do they actually represent the first bird of spring? And in my mind, they do not, because many of them do overwinter here. And you can see what the range map looks like. So we are within the range that you would expect to actually see them in the wintertime. But I think their numbers are increasing, and because of our landscaping in suburbia, I think they're becoming more conspicuous to most homeowners. So the robins are only going to migrate as far as they need to, because migration is a very expensive proposition. They do change their diet from worms to fruit, and so they can manage to stay here through the winter because they will find fruit. Again, partially because of our landscape habits. But again, migration is very difficult, and it does consume a lot of energy. So these birds are playing the odds, and they're not going to migrate any further than they have to. Those birds that don't migrate very far are going to be the ones that can return the quickest in the springtime and get those best territories. So the shorter distance that they migrate away, the quicker they can come back in the springtime. So it's really hard to say if the birds that we're seeing in the winter are actually birds that have decided to tough it out, or if we're seeing birds that have moved from the north and are now taking over our areas because they don't want to be very far from their territories that are way up in the north. The males are the birds that are most likely to spend their winters here in the cooler regions. And the reason for that is the females are going to require more food sources, better food sources, so that they can recharge for the next cycle of egg production. So they're more likely to move further south, and they don't have to claim the territories anyway. They're leaving that up to the males. So they will migrate further south where there's a better guarantee of good food sources. And that migration is driven more by food than temperature, because we have certainly seen robins here in the wintertime when we do have very cold conditions. And when those birds are returning in the spring, there's kind of a leading edge to their migration. It's actually formed by a 36-degree isotherm, because at that point, that's when earthworms start to emerge. And so they're not going to advance their migration any further than where they find those conditions. So let's talk a little bit about natural obstacles to migration. And here in North America, we really have the beautiful plan for migration. You can see that our mountain ranges here, the major ones being in the Rockies, and the Cascades here, and Appalachia here, all of them are running north and south. So none of them really create a huge obstacle to our birds that are trying to migrate. And the same thing with our water courses. All of our major rivers are also running north and south, also providing corridors to advance that migration. So the main thing that we have geographically that creates obstacles for them would be large bodies of water, because these birds do not want to cross large bodies of water. That's when they're at most risk. So the Gulf of Mexico creates an obstacle for them, as do the Great Lakes. And anyone that has gone to Ohio, to the McGee Marsh area in the springtime, which is on the southern shore of Lake Erie, can certainly understand that, because you'll see that the birds concentrate. Even though that's not a huge lake, they don't want to cross that lake unless they have very favorable conditions. And so they kind of stack up on that south shore, waiting for those optimum conditions to migrate further north. It's quite a spectacle, and if you've never done it, you should give that a try. Other natural obstacles would have to do with weather. And if you take a look at a weather map, here's an example, and you start to read where the highs and the lows are and where the fronts are, you can kind of predict or have an opportunity to sort of predict, when birds are going to be migrating. If we look at this high here, where winds actually work around the cell in a clockwise fashion, so they're going like this. And then if we have that up against a low where things are going counterclockwise, like this, if this was happening in the fall, you can see at this point of the curvature around the low, we're driving downward. And the same thing with this high here, if we're coming around clockwise, at this point of the curve, we're driving downwards. So any of these birds that are actually in this region here, this is like an expressway for them because all the conditions are favorable for them to actually move through, or they're going to get favorable wind conditions off of this pattern that's set up. And then if you have something that comes along like a front, and that frontal boundary creates some kind of weather event like precipitation, then you're going to have something that's going to put a halt to this rapid movement of wind and the birds moving down this way. And that's when we experience a fallout. And we certainly do experience those, but not anywhere near as dramatic as some of the ones I can remember from my earlier birding. But we do still see those fallouts. And that's great news for us. We get to see all these birds when they do hit the ground, but it's bad for the birds because ideally they would have continued their migration without any interruption. And there can be really large weather events that are going to have an impact on their migration as well. Things like hurricanes and tropical storms that are occurring down here or along the eastern seaboard can have a huge impact, especially when they do come inland, and it's going to alter the route that those birds might take. Or actually just push them off of their route. I do want to talk a little bit, just to give you some perspective on the magic of what's going on with migration. I wanted to talk about the Blackpoll Warbler, which has a very famous migration path. And here's a map that kind of shows how they're coming up from South America in the springtime. They're doing a lot of island hopping and coming and entering the United States here on the southern coast. And then they work their way up, and they actually, once they get up into the Midwest and across Canada, you can see that they have a very, very wide range. In the fall migration, many of them are actually migrating to the eastern seaboard in the mid-Atlantic states here, and that's going to be a jumping off point for them in order to return to South America. And we'll talk about that in more detail in just a minute. It's an incredible flight, as you can imagine. So here is that Blackpoll, both in breeding plumage there, the one with the black cap, and then in the winter or fall plumage. And this is a very, very small bird. You were talking about a bird that's a little over 4 inches long. Normally its weight is about 10 grams, but they will add to their body weight in preparation for migration. And so the length of days actually has an effect on the hypothalamus, which triggers then an increase in eating and storage of fat. And it's during this time, which is a couple weeks before they actually make their migration and actually continuing through migration, they'll add on fat considerably. And so they'll double their weight. So now you're talking about a bird that's now weighing about 20 grams. So if you have a minute, pull out about 4 pennies and hold those in your hand. And that's about what this bird weighs. Pretty incredible that a bird that weighs about as much as 4 pennies can make that flight that I just described a moment ago. So as I mentioned, they do converge on the northeast coast as far south as Virginia, and that's happening all through like mid-August and into September, and then they're at their jumping off point to make that journey to South America. And the timing of migration in general, including those birds that I'm just talking about, is pretty much just after the sun sets, the surface of the earth is cooling, everything's becoming very favorable for them to migrate. And if they do have some kind of a tailwind versus a headwind, and the weather looks clear, at least from their starting point, they're going to take off. And so most of those migrants are lifting off somewhere in the area of 45 to 60 minutes after sunset. And that's not a hard rule, certainly. They can be leaving later than that and even earlier than that. But the peak of migration activity in the nighttime is actually occurring around midnight. So let's say that those Blackpoll warblers had, they determined that they have favorable conditions and they lift off. Well, it's going to take an incredible amount of energy for them to do that, and they do have that extra fat. So with those sufficient fat stores, they can then make a flight like what I just described, or if they're actually migrating across the continental US, the larger their energy storage in fat, the less times they do have to stop unless they're driven down by a weather event. And so they then run less of a risk as far as hitting inhospitable areas where they might not be able to refuel. But studies have shown that a small passerine like that Blackpoll warbler will burn 0.08 of a gram of fat in an hour. And if they're traveling at a rate of about 27 miles an hour in favorable conditions, meaning they probably have a tailwind as opposed to a headwind, they're going to consume about 6.4 grams of fat at a minimum, and they're traveling in that flight that I described 2,000 miles, and it's taking them approximately 80 hours. So that's just simply amazing. Think about that for a minute. What can you do for 80 hours? We can't even sleep for 80 hours. So it's just remarkable that a small creature like this Blackpoll warbler can make those kinds of migrations. And this has been proven to happen. There's been a lot of research into this bird. There's been a lot of work with radar in order to determine, where the birds are going. And so there's a lot of information that supports the fact that they are making this remarkable migration. So the next time you see a Blackpoll warbler or any of our warblers or any of our small passerines that are migrating through our area, just think about the marvel of what they're accomplishing, and just think about how delicate that balance is between their success and failure. And a lot of the things that we're doing as humans is having a dramatic effect on tipping that balance. So even though they've been doing this migration for over hundreds of thousands of years, we could be the ones that put an end to that. So do think about that. So thanks for taking the time to view this video. Hopefully we've given you some bird food for thought, and I hope that you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related.